Good afternoon, boys and girls. This is John Cole, also called CyberTal. We're finishing up our review of isolated queen-pawn procedures and concepts. This will be the final game looking at how to handle an isolated pawn. Next video, we're going to do a brief review of the concepts. I'll sort of talk through some things. It'll be very light on variations, but very heavy on final review of ideas. And then we'll move on to the next session. So thank you for sticking with me so far. The game I chose, it's sort of a catch-all, because the first two games we had looked at a direct kingside attack. This is a bit more of a global way of playing an isolated queen-pawn. So not surprisingly, the white pieces were played by Tigger and Petrosian, not exactly known for direct kingside attacks, but much more known for sort of enveloping, all-encompassing positional play. He was playing Petrosian-Spassky. This is while Spassky was still world champion before he lost the title to Fischer in '72. Petrosian was white, d4, dx4. This is the Queen's Gambit accepted. There was a certain stigma against this for some reason. I would say in the 10s and 20s, all the way up to, say, the 40s and 50s. And then sort of the dogma was lifted as more serious analysis was lifted, finally invested into it. It's perfectly fine. It just leads to a different class of positions and the Queen's Gambit declined. But it's perfectly fine for black. Knight f3, this is the classical way of playing. More aggressive, I would say, would be e4. A lot of times you reach a position like... and then bishop d3. This is very much favored by aggressive players with the white pieces. Like, I'm reasonably certain Nakamura has played e4 several times. This is what white plays if he wants a much more aggressive game than the classical Queen's Gambit accepted. White takes on a slightly backward, or definitely backward pawn in d4. In return, he gets his cramping pawn on e5. If black decides to castle kingside, he'll often find himself under direct and decisive attack. So a lot of times, black will either not castle or castle queenside in these variations. Very sharp variation. There's plenty of winning chances for both sides here. Knight f3, that's the main move, leads to much more classical play. So we just go down the main line. A4. So this is an invention of Akiba Rubinstein's. As I've said in a few of my previous videos, Akiba Rubinstein more or less helped to invent the foundations for modern chess. He's a completely foundational player to a lot of major variations in how we play chess in the modern world. He's one of the most important chess players in history, even though he never won the world title. So A4, obviously, it stops the pawn push B5, so it clamps down on black's queenside expansion ideas. In return, it weakens this b4 square. So a knight hopping from c6 to b4 is going to have a permanent outpost. That knight in b4 is going to stop this light square bishop from creating that vital mating battery against the king side. The bishop won't be able to drop back to c2, and the queen won't be able to go to d3 to create that battery. So that is a serious trade-off. Is it worth it? I would say evidence shows that it's more or less neutral. It's no better or worse than the other major tries, but it's a completely valid way of playing. The two other major lines that I highlighted, dxc5 is the hyper-technical option. White has a little bit of edge in mobilization and development, so he's going to try to exploit that in a completely symmetrical position. White scores okay, but I think objectively this is just dead equal. It's hard for white to make something of this position without black making an error, which he often enough does, or she often enough does. The most interesting, probably the modern mainline, is bishop b3. The bishop proactively drops back from c4, so then on b5, he doesn't have to retreat the bishop. He can play a4. And then that's hitting that pawn on b5. He's going to try to prove that b5 is a weakness. Objectively, I think black is fine, but white scores incredibly well from here. And I think modern practice does give white a decent enough edge to work with in this situation. But a4, in my opinion, the most strategically interesting. It keeps the greatest amount of winning chances on the board. c6, queen e2. So because of this a4 weakness and because of the knight coming to b4, white's going to have to arrange his piece a little bit differently than a traditional IQP. He doesn't really want to do the usual rook e1, knight c3, bishop g5 stuff, because there's no mating battery to form on the b1 to h7 diagonal because of that forthcoming knight on b4. So white needs to arrange his piece a little bit differently. Queen e2 is a part of that. So cx d4, rook d1. So this is the point. So the queen goes to e2, and then the rook will go to d1, and then white can continue with normal isolated queen pawn development. So standard play so far. Bishop e7. Knight d5. So this is the most solid in my opinion. There's another modern choice of knight b4. A lot of times this will just transpose to another variation. In my opinion, knight d5 is the most solid because it directly blocks the d4-d5 push. Just once more from the top, when you're playing with an isolated pawn, if you have sufficient resources to do so, you should always look at the d4-d5 push. That liquidating push is sort of the core of the isolated queen pawn's side. It's the core of their play. If that push is possible, you want to seriously examine it, whether it's a trade or not. Your pawn breaks are sort of the engine of your activity in chess. So in this position, calculating d5 is always a part of white's plans. So black just directly stops it. So queen e4, this is one of the main moves. Modern preference seems to be bishop b3, threatening to drop the bishop back to c2. So black puts a stop to that. And then now that the knight's left to c6 square, the knight can hop to e5. This is a complicated fight. I prefer white a little bit, but that's just sort of subjectively, because I enjoy playing with the isolated pawn. I think this, objectively, is probably equal with a good fight to come. But queen e4 is perfectly valid. At cb4, knight f6 is probably a little bit more solid, just asking the queen where she wants to go. If the queen goes back, of course, we're happy to repeat moves. But if we don't repeat moves, it's hard to find a great place to put the queen. Queen h4 is potentially a line, but then you could always just hit the queen again. So knight cb4 is the choice if black wants to keep the game going to try to generate winning chances. Since this was a closed round robin, Spassky might have been seriously considering trying to win as black to try to keep pace in the tournaments. So knight e5. Now the knight's left to c6 square, we hop into the usual square for this knight in the isolated queen pawn. Rook a7. This is, in my opinion, just has to be an error. Just has to be. This rook will make sense as soon as b6 is accomplished. Then the rook can swing over to c7. But until b6 is accomplished, it's just sort of sitting there in the corner. Plus we're spending a tempo to put the rook there. This game was covered in Kasparov in his great predecessor series. He gives b6 sort of offhandedly, but this is one of the main options of theory, and it's also the first choice of the engines. The critical line, and Kasparov gives this, is knight c6, so this is a piece sacrifice. Now, this looks dangerous, but this actually somehow works out for black. Bishop g4 is the top choice. So this is a very clever move. So obviously, if the queen takes, queen just takes the bishop on d5 and black's up a piece. Now, if white plays f3, then we just drop the bishop back to d7. Bishop d6. And this actually looks like enough compensation for black. This f3 move really weakened the white king side. Black has some tempo winners coming. He's got rook c8, potentially bring the rook to c2. He can play rook e8. He's going to have fast development. White's king side is quite weakened. And the only trump that white has is this extra pawn. Now, it's a passed pawn, but that is his only trump, whereas black has a couple different things to work with. So, in my opinion, this is full compensation. If he plays rook e1, just directly, and we just trade down to a draw. This is dead equal. So yeah, in my opinion, b6 is probably the best move here, probably the most solid. If black's looking to keep winning chances on the board, it's hard to in this position. That's why I sort of prefer knight f6 previously. In this position, you potentially take, but this is probably just better for white. Yeah, this is better for white. Yeah, I would just stick with b6. It leads to a dead position, but you sort of made your bed already. But rook a7 truly is just putting yourself in an awkward position. This rook is just completely misplaced. Bishop b3, probably queen g4 is a little bit more combative. The bishop dropping back to b3 doesn't have any benefits just yet. It can't move to c2, so there's not really a reason to invest the tempo. Let's say king h8, queen h5. And white's starting to build the attack pretty nicely. The queen can drop back to h3 when attacked, because the knight on e5 blocks an e5 push. So the queen can roost on h3, and then we can just continue to bring her pieces over to the king's side. I don't want to overstate white's advantage. The black is still solid, but I think white has a good attacking position here. So bishop b3, not, in my opinion, not the best. Queen h4. So this is an option now that knight's on e5, because there's a safe spot on h3 for the queen. b6, planning on getting the rook over and playing bishop b7, or just playing bishop b7 directly. But if we play bishop b7 directly, then what was the point of playing rook a7? Convince me why. Queen g3, bishop b7. So yeah, black has managed to get his bishop developed in this nice diagonal. Now, first off, in these isolated queen pawn positions, we've often seen that the bishop being on the long diagonal is overrated to begin with. A lot of times it will serve a better defensive function, holding up this e6 pawn. But now the bishop's on b7, this rook on a7 truly doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Black is still okay here, but it is asking a lot from his position, since he's going to end up being pretty darn cramped. Instead of this, I think knight h5 is probably the most circumspect, trying to get a repetition here. h3, knight f6. And if white decides to avoid the repetition, you can play bishop g5. And then rook c7 first, before we put the bishop on b7. And I would favor white a little bit, but this is still a very good fight to come. I think knight h5 just is better. When you're fighting against the isolated pawn, you want to try to delay your opponent's attacking mechanism as much as possible. Don't just let him build up at leisure. That's almost always a mistake. Whereas bishop b7, it looks nice, but it doesn't generate any threats for black. So white can just sort of continue his build without difficulty. Bishop h6, knight e8. So now the rook on a7 is terrible. Look at these pieces huddled up in the back. Really, the only good piece that black has is the knight on b4, but that's nowhere near the king's side. So I think white's definitely a little bit better here. Rook ac1. When you look at the games of the all-time greats, you will see over and over again they finish their developments. Even just here, you know, white could have considered playing d5 immediately and tried to be a bit more aggressive. But Petrosian just trusts in finishing his development. Finish your mobilization above all else. Don't know why I did that. Finish your mobilization above all else. Don't let your position fall behind development. Finish your mobilization relentlessly. It'll almost always pay dividends for you. King h8. So this truly is the first major error and probably the final error here. Rook e8 was necessary. Black just needs to get this rook into the game. Just absolutely needs to. It's mandatory. The critical try here for white to break the trenches is d5. I've analyzed a couple of main variations. I didn't want to go too long in these because it's not to the point of the themes that we're trying to review here. But it is characteristic of a lot of isolated queen pawn fights, the tactics that we see in this line. So as usual, the d5 clearance sacrifice is something you always want to have in mind, even if it's a sacrifice. If you can achieve d5, even if it's giving up a pawn, a lot of times that'll unleash all the activity and mobilization in your position. So ex d5. Bishop, if he continues as in the game, bishop e3, that's not the most critical. Probably rook d4 is most critical, lifting the rook over to attack. Bishop c5. And then there's two main variations. I'll just give the calm one. I give an exchange sacrifice that you can look at in the notes. This position, I think this is just very complicated. I think it's balanced on a knife edge. Basically, the first side to make a major error loses. I think this is completely balanced. Black's got an extra pawn, but white has incredible activity. But he doesn't have a clear win just yet. But if he continues bishop e3, as in the game, the difference is we drop that rook back to a8, so now rook c8, there's not a pin on this diagonal that makes this pawn even more weak. And black is holding this position. So instead of bishop e3, the key move here is rook d4, and there's a huge fight to come. So check the notes for the main analysis that I give in that position. King h8 is just way too passive. It doesn't get this rook into the game. It doesn't mobilize any more of its pieces. It generates a threat against this bishop on h6, but white can override that threat by creating even greater threats. So d5. This is the thematic clearance sacrifice that you always want to be looking at when you have an isolated queen pawn. Even if it gives up a pawn, it helps unleash your activity. So here it's still complicated, but Petrosian has calculated everything perfectly. This is the perfect time for this clearance sacrifice to unleash white's pieces. EXD5, this is probably not the most accurate. Bishop takes is most accurate because it looks to get pieces off the board. When you're defending, especially in an isolated queen pawn scenario, you want to trade minor pieces. Those are sort of the engines for the isolated queen pawn's play. B7, and this is just an example line that I give. So here, black is still up a pawn, but white controls the c-file. He has a humongous amount of activity. White's definitely for choice here. He's going to at least get the d5 pawn back. Maybe the b6 pawn will fall as well. But black is still in this and defending, whereas EXD5 doesn't get any pieces off the board. Another error, if he takes a bishop on h6, this is an obvious error, so it's just a very short variation. But and I could have given some more analysis from here, but really all it boils down to, that pawn on f7 is the most powerful piece on the board. It's worth at least a minor piece, maybe even at least a rook. The queen can never leave the back rank because of queen g8 with mates. White's just winning. This is just a completely won position. The bishop is paralyzed because of knight c4, exploiting the pin. This is just a completely winning position. So EXD5 looks to survive. But bishop e3, and one reason I wanted to give this game, and it's sort of unique in that white plays that clearance sacrifice, which is sort of set up to showcase a kingside attack, and all of a sudden he just suddenly shifts his focus over to this, until now, inconsequential seeming weakness on b6. I think it's really artistic the way Petrosian accomplishes this. It's very unique. You don't often see a bold clearance sacrifice like this used to exploit a queenside weakness. Very exciting. I love Petrosian's games. This is one of the games I most remember looking at when I was a kid. So rook e8, finally mobilizes the rook, but this is too late. Knight c4, so exploits the pin on the d file to get after this weak b pawn. Knight d6 is the main choice of b5. Reason I give this, knight x b5 would be a mistake because of bishop a6. Material's back to even, but black's able to develop some activity. It's much more important to keep control of the position, so knight b6 is the best choice. White keeps complete control of the position because we know he's going to get at least the pawn back. He doesn't need to rush that. So knight b6 hits the rook on a8. It's getting the pawn back under more favorable circumstances. And then the knight takes on d5. So in this symmetrical position, the only factors are white's overwhelming activity. Every single one of white's pieces are better than their black counterpart. And this pawn on b5 is much weaker than pawn on b2. So white's close to technically winning here. So knight d6 was a choice. Bishop x b6. This is the only move, and this is Petrosian's choice in the game. If knight b6, if a knight takes on b6, this shows how easy it is to lose control of the position. And suddenly we have a repetition. So just one move is all it takes to lose control, but Petrosian does a perfect job of keeping everything under control. So bishop takes. Knight e5. Knight e3 is more accurate because it aims directly for that weak pawn, but knight e5 is well within Petrosian's style. He's looking to just completely blockade all of the weaknesses on the queen side. He's just keeping complete control of the position. This is perfectly well within his style. Knight f5. Bishop c8 was a bit more tenacious. Queens come off. a5. This is the most powerful move of the game, in my opinion. It just accomplishes basically everything. It's like a nail in a coffin. It immobilizes the weak a pawn. It completely supports the bishop on b6. Because the bishop on b6 supported, the rook can't come to d8. It's just this one little pawn move nails down the entire position for whites. Just very beautiful. Bishop g5, rook b1. d4, this looks a little bit froggy, but without pieces to support it, it can't go anywhere. The rook can't come to d8, so ultimately this pawn is just a weakness. d5, knight c6, bishop a4, chasing the knight away, f4, hitting the bishop away, knight c7, challenging for the c-file, and he's got this well calculated. Bishop c6, and here's an example of where Petrosian chooses the practical way of converting. He chooses b7. When you look at this with the engine, it's not the point-by-point best way to convert, but it's the easiest human way to convert. Bishop e4 is strictly superior. And white's completely winning as well. But the game choice just keeps complete control. This is a very nice technique from Petrosian. g4, kick the knight away. And then one move before the time control, Spassky resigns. There's no defense at all. So just a very slow plan of bishop d5, bishop xe6, rook c7, rook c8. That's it. Now just spell that out with moves just so everyone sees it. And there's no way for black to stop rook c8 check. And the pawn is queens. So beautiful conversion for Petrosian. The key to the game was much earlier, of course. Rook a7 is really where black's problems begin. Misplacing this one piece sort of sets the tone and sort of establishes black's woes. You can't misplace a rook like that and not expect... at the very least, you're investing time later to try to rescue that rook. And then in the game, white's able to just slowly build up and inconvenience black's pieces. Here, black's position is just completely critical. King h8 is just easy overlook. Black needs to spend that tempo to get the rook back into the game. If he does that, this is still a fight. You know, I think white's slightly better, but it's definitely still a fight. But the fact that black is allowing d5 under these terms, this is the sort of scenario that when you have an isolated pawn you're looking for. Every one of your pieces are developed. They're all optimally placed. It's time to open the position, even if it's a sacrifice. Those are the signs you want to look for to see if d4, d5 is a viable push. But the really artistic part about this game is usually with a d4, d5 clearance sacrifice, you see a kingside attack. Here, Petrosian uses that clearance sacrifice to take advantage of the queenside, which I thought was unique and clever and artistic. But it doesn't depart from the usual program with the d4, d5 clearance sacrifice. You're opening the position up to exploit the superior placing of your pieces. You know, every one of white's pieces here is superior to their black counterparts. It doesn't matter if white's down a pawn, because you're investing that pawn to open the position up so your piece can actually take advantage of that activity. So, beautiful game from Petrosian. Bit of a short game, but I just wanted to review this last bit of concepts. This will be the final example game. Tomorrow we'll do a quick video to review all of the concepts, and then we're going to move on to hanging pawns. So, my name is John. I'll talk to you tomorrow.